The cardiac alarm screamed at 2:47 a.m. Katie Morrison's hands froze on the medication cart 3 floors below the sound, a syringe suspended between her thumb and forefinger, sodium chloride hanging in the fluorescent-lit air of the night shift at Oak Creek Memorial. The alarm didn't scream like most alarms. This one had a pitch that meant code. This one meant someone was dying right now. She set the syringe down with deliberate care. Turned. Moved. The hallway tiles clicked beneath her boots, worn leather, creased at the edges, the kind of boots that had walked through sand dunes and rubble and kept walking anyway. Her right leg took the stairs with a slight pause, a hesitation that came from shattered bone and titanium screws and 18 years of pretending nobody noticed. By the time she reached the cardiac unit on the 3rd floor, 3 nurses stood frozen outside the patient's room, their faces the particular shade of pale that meant no doctor had answered the overhead page. Meant they were alone with a dying patient and a monitor that sounded like a fire alarm. Katie didn't knock. Didn't ask. She moved into the room and the world contracted to a single patient, a man in his 60s, thin-chested, skin gone grey beneath the oxygen mask. His chest was rising, but wrong. Hyperinflated on the left side, the rib cage bulging like something was pushing from the inside out. She placed her hand flat against his ribs. Felt it. The subcutaneous emphysema, the air tracking under the skin, crackling like rice cereal against her palm. She tilted his neck left. The trachea had already shifted, deviated hard to the right, the larynx twisted like someone had wrung his neck. No breath sounds on the left. Nothing. Dead silence on an entire side of his chest. Tension pneumothorax. The kind that kills in minutes. The kind that meant his heart couldn't fill, couldn't beat, and in seconds his blood pressure would follow the monitor into the basement. Katie's voice came out level. Crash cart. 14-gauge needle. It wasn't a request. It was the voice of someone who had said things like that before, who had spoken in that particular register of calm authority in places where calm authority was the difference between going home and going into a body bag. The nurses moved like she'd pulled a string attached to their spines. One of them pressed against the cart. The other pulled open the emergency supplies. Hands trembling, breath shallow, eyes locked on this quiet night shift nurse who had suddenly become something else entirely. Katie's own hands didn't tremble. Had never trembled. That was a luxury for people who had the space to be afraid. She swabbed the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The skin went orange with betadine, an iodine bright circle marking the exact point between 2 ribs where a needle would slide through muscle and pleura and into the pressurized lung. The fluorescent lights hummed above her. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped its steady, unconcerned rhythm. The patient's monitor screamed. O2 sat dropping, 68%. 64%. The numbers falling like a stone through water. Katie picked up the 14-gauge needle and didn't hesitate. The needle went in between the 2nd and 3rd ribs with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory older than her nursing license. Comes from places where hesitation meant people didn't walk out. The first inch of resistance. The soft give as she punched through the parietal pleura. And then. The hiss. Not a whisper. A hiss. The sound of air escaping under pressure, the lung collapsing back into its proper shape, the pressure equalizing, the trachea relaxing back toward center. It sounded like air escaping from a tire. It sounded like salvation. The patient gasped. His back arched off the bed, real movement, conscious movement, the movement of someone whose brain was suddenly getting oxygen again. The monitor's rhythm changed. Still fast, still panicked, but now there was an actual heartbeat beneath it. Real electrical activity. Real perfusion. His eyes fluttered and his pupils constricted, and Katie watched the color start to come back to his face like someone was painting watercolor across gray canvas. O2 sat climbing, 75%. 82%. 88%. Climbing toward normal. Get me a chest tube set up, Katie said, already pulling the needle back out. And call up to ICU. We need a bed. The code team arrived 60 seconds later, 2 residents who looked like they'd been texting, an attending physician with yesterday's coffee still on his breath, a respiratory therapist carrying a portable chest X-ray. They flooded the room in a chaos of voices and equipment, but by then the patient was already stable. By then the crisis had passed. By then Katie was already stepping back, already becoming invisible again, already folding herself into the corner of the room like something without weight or presence. The attending glanced at her. "What happened?" "Tension pneumothorax," Katie said. "Needle decompression at 2:47. Breath sounds returned immediately. Vitals stabilizing." She said it the way someone would describe reading a chart. Said it the way you describe something ordinary, routine, the kind of thing any night shift nurse with decent reflexes might do. The attending nodded and turned back to the patient without another word, already mentally moving on to the next task, the next problem, the next patient who didn't happen to have a major in emergency medicine who'd spent 3 tours in Mosul keeping people alive when the alternative was a flag folded into a triangle and a knock on a door at 0600 hours. What Katie didn't know, not yet, not for another 10 minutes, was that the man lying on this bed, the man whose life was now beating back into normal rhythm on the monitor, was a Coast Guard commander. Not just any commander, but the commanding officer of a man named Bradley Chen. Not just any Major Bradley Chen, but the major who'd been her son. The same commanding officer who, 6 months after Bradley had been killed by an IED in Sanjin Valley, had written her a letter that said, "Your son was the finest operator I have ever served with, and the reason 43 of his brothers came home." The same letter she'd read 732 times and kept in a locked drawer beneath photographs she couldn't quite bring herself to burn. The attending was already barking orders. "Call cardiothoracic. I want him upstairs in 8 minutes. And somebody get this chart." He looked at the 3 frozen nurses. "What's his name? What do we know?" One of them checked the board, her voice shaking slightly. Commander James Patterson. Coast Guard. He came in this morning with blunt chest trauma. Motor vehicle collision. Said he was fine." The attending swore quietly and started reading the chart notes, but Katie had already moved toward the door, already becoming the invisible night shift nurse again, already pushing her medication cart back down the hallway toward the patients who didn't require her to remember how to stay calm while the world tried to kill them. Her locker on the 4th floor was small, metal, indistinguishable from 47 others that lined the staff break room. She opened it at 4:30 a.m. during her break, during the hour when the hospital felt like it belonged to ghosts. Extra scrubs on the top shelf. A hairbrush she never used. A photograph of her son in his dress blues, grinning like he was in on a joke nobody else would ever understand. And hidden in the back, beneath a stack of folded clothes, a pair of worn combat boots. The leather was cracked and weathered. Sand was still embedded in the treads. The laces were frayed. They hadn't been worn in 3 years. She pulled them out just far enough to see them. Didn't take them out. Just looked at the place where her son's photograph stared at nothing and her past lived in a pair of boots that nobody at Oak Creek Memorial was supposed to know she owned. Dr. Hargrove found her in the break room at 6:15 a.m., standing at the coffee machine with a cup that had gone cold. He was still in his coat from the parking lot, keys in one hand and the patient chart he'd signed off on in the other. The chart that showed a patient who was fine. Stable. No intervention needed. The chart that didn't match what Katie had documented in her 2:47 a.m. nursing notes about pharmaceutical discrepancies and medications missing from the inventory and a prescription that didn't match what the patient had actually received. Hargrove's eyes moved across her face like he was reading something written in a language only he understood. Then his expression shifted. Calculated. The smile that came next was the smile of a man who had just realized that someone in the room knew something that could cost him everything. "Quite the night," he said, his voice smooth as surgical steel. "That commander upstairs. Good save." Katie didn't answer. She turned the coffee cup in her hands and said nothing, and the silence that filled the break room was the kind of silence that comes right before something breaks. The fluorescent lights of the hospital conference room hummed their dead monotone as Katie slid into a chair in the back row, 23 nurses and 4 residents already seated around the pressboard table. 7 a.m. staff meetings were mandatory, Dr. Hargrove's way of establishing dominance before the shift even started. He stood at the front in his white coat, sleeves rolled precisely to mid-forearm, the kind of man who treated perfection like a weapon. His eyes scanned the room until they found her. They always did now. "Nurse Morrison," he said, his voice smooth as chrome. "Perhaps you can enlighten us on the updated sepsis protocol from 2019. The room shifted. Everyone knew she'd transferred to Oak Creek 2 years ago. She wasn't here in 2019. That was the point. Katie met his gaze without blinking. "I follow current evidence-based practice, Doctor." His smile widened, the smile of a man who'd already won the hand before the cards were dealt. "That's not what I asked. The 3-hour bundle modification from that year, the specific documentation changes. Walk us through it." Silence stretched like pulled taffy. She could feel Sarah Chen tense beside her, could sense Marcus Webb shifting in his seat 3 rows over. They'd worked her shifts often enough to know this wasn't a question. It was a garrote disguised as inquiry. "I implement the current standard of care," Katie said, her voice flat and measured. "Updated protocols supersede outdated ones." "So you're admitting you don't know protocols that every competent nurse should have memorized?" His eyes glinted. Around the table, residents were taking notes. New graduates were watching their charge nurse get carved up in real time. This was theater. This was power. "Perhaps we should discuss your continuing education requirements." Katie's hands lay flat on the table. She let the silence extend, 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10, until the discomfort became visible on Hargrove's face, a slight tightening of his jaw. When she finally spoke, her voice dropped into a register that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her chest. "If you spent half this energy on patient care instead of performance art, we might actually save lives." She stood, pushed her chair back with deliberate slowness, and walked toward the door. Behind her, whispers erupted like a match to kindling. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. But Hargrove watched her leave with eyes that held calculation instead of anger. This was the moment his strategy shifted. This was when a man cornered by competence decides to burn down the structure instead of admitting he'd underestimated it. Within hours, the reassignments began. Sarah Chen, who'd worked beside Katie for 2 years, who covered her bathroom breaks, who knew her routines like choreography, was transferred to the orthopedic floor effective immediately. Marcus Webb, the senior male nurse on her rotation, shifted to pediatrics 3 floors down. The message was silent and absolute: work with her and disappear. Katie watched it happen with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst life has to offer. When she checked the schedule at noon, her name appeared in the overnight rotation column, permanent. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., the graveyard shift, working alongside new graduates who wouldn't question orders because they didn't know anything yet. Isolation looked like staffing changes. Destruction looked like administration. By Tuesday afternoon, Hargrove had already made 3 phone calls from his office. Katie knew this because the hospital operator, Mrs. Delores, who'd been running the switchboard for 17 years, mentioned it casually while Katie was getting coffee. "Dr. Hargrove's been calling board members." 3 separate conversations. He sounds upset. The kind of upset that comes with carefully modulated rage. The kind that ends careers. He was positioning this precisely. A transfer request to the satellite clinic in Portsmouth had already been drafted. Katie could see it on the memo board outside Dr. Patricia Vance's office, Dr. Hargrove's handwriting looping across the top: recommend transfer for interpersonal development and fresh start in lower acuity setting. Translated, get her out before she pieces together the pharmaceutical discrepancies she's been noticing. The post-surgical patients with missing dosages. The controlled substance logs that didn't match administration records. All of it signed by Hargrove. All of it pointing toward the kind of federal investigation that ended licenses. 3 days into his campaign, Katie was waiting for the elevator to leave the 4th floor when the doors slid open and Hargrove stepped in. She was already positioned near the back. There was nowhere to go. He moved with deliberate slowness to the button panel, his body angled to block it, his jaw set like he'd made a decision and was committed to seeing it through. "You need to understand something," he said, his voice low and controlled. "There's a hierarchy in medicine. Doctors lead. Nurses follow. When you step outside that role, when you challenge a physician in front of staff, there are consequences." He kept talking, 90 seconds of escalating lecture about scope creep, about overstepping authority, about nurses who forgot their place. His voice was level, almost professorial, the kind of voice that made threat sound like mentorship. Katie stood utterly motionless, eyes forward, watching the floor numbers tick down. 1. When the silence finally came because he'd run out of breath, she turned her head slightly. "Your insecurity is showing, Doctor," she said. "It doesn't suit you." She stepped around him and exited on the first floor without another word, leaving him standing in the elevator alone as the doors closed. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came on Thursday night when Katie opened her locker after a shift and found "Grunt Nurse" spray-painted in red across the inside door, letters jagged and crude, the kind of thing that took planning and access. Her combat boots, the only thing she'd kept from Mosul, always buried deep under her civilian running shoes, hidden in the back corner where no one would think to look, were in the trash bin 15 feet away. Sand still clung to the treads. Her boots. The last physical remnant of the person she'd spent 12 years trying to bury. She picked them up without expression, the leather worn smooth from a decade of desert operations, the laces stiff with dried sweat and dust. Pieces of Mosul. Pieces of the night the IED took 2 of her medics and shattered her femur and changed everything. She turned slowly to see Hargrove standing in the doorway to the men's locker room, his face carefully neutral, watching her reaction like an entomologist watching an insect's final movements. "Vandalism and theft," Katie said, her voice absolutely steady despite the trembling in her hands. "That's 2 felonies before lunch, Doctor." She walked past him toward HR, each step controlled and precise, ice running through her veins even as something deeper, something older, began to wake up inside her chest. A voice that hadn't spoken in 12 years. A person she'd left in the desert and tried to convince herself had died there. In the HR office, Carol Jennings was already looking uncomfortable when Katie sat down. On Jennings' computer screen, barely visible but unmistakable, was an email from Dr. Hargrove. The timestamp said 6:47 a.m. Before the staff meeting. Before he'd blocked the elevator. Before the locker room. He'd been planning this for days. The subject line read, "Urgent, personnel concern." Katie placed her boots on the desk between them, sand falling onto the laminate. "I need to file a report," she said. That same morning, Katie had been processing intake when the ambulance arrived with a Coast Guard commander, chest trauma from a training accident offshore. Stable vitals. Routine admission. She'd run the paperwork automatically, processing names and dates and emergency contacts in that thoughtless rhythm nurses develop, until she saw it, emergency contact, Major Bradley Chen, Special Forces. Her hands had stopped. She'd read it again to be sure. Major Bradley Chen. Her son's commanding officer. The man who'd written the letter she'd found in her son's barracks bag, the letter that said Bradley was the finest operator I've ever served with and your son will come home. The man who'd been looking after her boy in ways she couldn't from Norfolk, in ways that mattered in places she tried not to think about. The commander was in bed 7, vital stable, relaxing medication ordered. Katie checked on him before her shift ended, per routine, and noticed his oxygen saturation dropping slightly, 96% instead of the 98 where it had been 2 hours earlier. Nothing alarming. Nothing anyone else would flag. But her eyes, trained in combat medicine, recognized the subtle descent. The beginning of something. The warning signs that came 3 hours before crisis. The elevator doors slid open and Dr. Hargrove stepped inside. He didn't move. His arm extended across the opening, blocking the exit, his body angled to trap Katie in the shrinking space. His smile was the kind that doesn't reach eyes, practiced, predatory, the smile of a man who'd spent 2 decades learning how to hurt people and call it accountability. Knowing your place, Morrison, he said, his voice steady and low, the tone of someone who doesn't need to raise volume to be heard. That's what separates professionals from people like you. He leaned against the door frame, completely unhurried. You think you can challenge me in front of the staff? Question my judgment. His eyes tracked her face, searching for the crack he expected to find. You're a floor nurse. That's all. And floor nurses don't correct their physicians. They don't contradict them. They don't, he paused, letting silence amplify his words. Walk out of meetings. Katie stood motionless. Her breathing steady. Her hands at her sides. She looked at him the way you'd look at a weather pattern, observable, temporary, irrelevant. Not with anger. Not with fear. With the kind of flat, measured calm that comes from having already survived worse things than this man could conceive. He waited for a response, for an apology, a flinch, a tremor in her voice. Something. Anything that would confirm his dominance. The silence stretched like a rubber band pulled taut. 3 seconds. 4. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Your insecurity is showing, Doctor, Katie said quietly. Her voice didn't shake. Didn't waver. Didn't carry emotion at all, it carried something worse, absolute indifference. It doesn't suit you. She stepped around him in one smooth motion, her shoulder brushing past without hesitation or deference, and walked into the corridor. The elevator doors slid shut behind her. Hargrove stood alone in the metal box, his arms still extended into empty space, his professional mask cracking just enough to register that something had broken in his carefully constructed hierarchy. The feeling would fester. It would grow. And he would spend the next 48 hours making her pay for it. 2 hours later, Katie opened her locker during the shift change. The spray paint hit her first, black aerosol, crude letters scrawled across the interior metal surface, grunt nurse. Bold. Deliberate. A message written slowly enough for anyone to understand the malice behind it. The smell of the paint lingered, still wet, telling her this had happened within the last 2 hours. During her patient rounds. When the locker room was empty. She didn't react. Didn't call for witnesses or march to administration. She simply reached into the back corner of the locker, past the folded scrubs and the spare shoes, toward the one possession she'd kept hidden since arriving at Oak Creek Memorial. The boots were there. Coyote tan leather, the soles worn through in places, the laces frayed at the edges. Combat boots from Mosul. The only physical proof that the woman standing in the locker room had ever been anyone other than a quiet night shift nurse in Norfolk. She'd wrapped them in a plastic grocery bag and buried them in the back, hidden from casual glances, hidden from questions, hidden from a life that was supposed to be anonymous and separate and safe. They were in the trash bin now. Someone had pulled them out and thrown them away like garbage. The message was clear: we found your secret, and we're showing you what we think of it. Katie picked them up without expression. Dust and a loose thread came away in her hand. The leather was cold, and her fingers traced the heel where shrapnel had scored a thin line years ago, a souvenir from a convoy outside Fallujah. She held the boots in both hands, standing very still, her chest rising and falling in measured rhythm. Across the locker room, Hargrove watched from near the supply cabinets. He'd positioned himself there deliberately, far enough away to deny orchestrating the vandalism, close enough to witness her reaction. He was waiting for the moment. The breakdown. The tears. The moment where she'd understand that he held the power to destroy her, one humiliation at a time. Katie turned. Her eyes found his across the 30 feet of linoleum and fluorescent light. She didn't move toward him. She simply looked at him while holding those boots, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the kind of clarity that makes rooms go quiet. Vandalism and theft, she said, each were distinct and measured. That's 2 felonies before lunch, Doctor. She didn't wait for a response. She placed the boots carefully on the bench beside her, then walked directly toward the administrative wing, her hands trembling even as ice ran through her veins. The trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint, the physical manifestation of a woman holding back something far larger than this moment. Something that had been locked down so carefully for so long that the pressure of keeping it contained was starting to show in the small involuntary ways that bodies betray what minds refuse to acknowledge. HR was on the 3rd floor. The elevator ride was silent except for the soft mechanical whine of ascending. Katie's reflection stared back at her from the polished metal doors, a woman in scrubs with damp hands and a spine so straight it looked like iron. The doors opened at the 3rd floor. She stepped out into the carpeted hallway where everything smelled like conference rooms and fluorescent humidifier spray, where nothing smelled like blood or diesel or muscle or anything real at all. The HR office was small. Beige. The kind of space designed to feel neutral and official simultaneously. Sharon Michaels, the HR director, looked up from her desk as Katie appeared in the doorway. Sharon was the type of administrator who'd been working in hospitals for 19 years and had learned to recognize the look of someone about to file a formal complaint, a look of perfect composure masking catastrophic anger. "Katie," Sharon said carefully. "What can I help with?" "I need to report vandalism of hospital property," Katie said, and her voice was steady enough to sound like she was ordering lunch. "Defacement of a locker and theft of personal property. I have a witness. Dr. Hargrove was present when I discovered it." Sharon's eyes widened slightly. She pulled out a notepad with the deliberate slowness of someone who'd just realized this morning was about to become significantly more complicated. "Tell me everything," she said. By the time Katie finished explaining, Sharon had already made 3 notes and was reaching for the phone. What she didn't understand, what no one in Oak Creek Memorial understood, was that Katie Morrison wasn't just reporting vandalism. She was creating documentation. Evidence. A paper trail that would matter far more than she could possibly know in the hours that were about to unfold, because somewhere on the 4th floor, Dr. Hargrove was meeting with Chief of Medicine Vance, and in his hands was a classified file he shouldn't have access to, a file that proved Katie Morrison was something other than a quiet nurse with a calm bedside manner and steady hands. A file that proved she was a weapon. And weapons, once exposed, had to be neutralized before they could be used. Dennis Walsh had IT access at Oak Creek Memorial, which meant he had everything Hargrove needed. The contractor worked from a basement office 3 floors below the main hospital records, surrounded by humming servers and the blue glow of monitor screens, and when Dr. Hargrove appeared at his door at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, Walsh knew immediately this wasn't a routine password reset. Hargrove closed the door behind him, locked it, and placed a manila envelope on Walsh's desk. Inside, photographs of Walsh's daughter at her private school in Virginia, her daily schedule printed out, pick-up times and locations documented with precision. Walsh's hands went cold. "I need personnel files," Hargrove said, his voice steady as a surgeon's hand. "Specifically, Katie Morrison's complete military record. Everything classified, everything sealed. And I need it tonight." Walsh didn't ask why. People didn't ask why when they understood the threat. 20 minutes later, the files were open on his screen, not the civilian nursing credentials, but the real record. Major Katie Morrison. Special Forces Group. Medical discharge, 2013. And as Hargrove read, his entire face changed. The classified file was a document that didn't officially exist. Designation, Operation Copper Angel. Katie Morrison's medical discharge summary detailed injuries sustained during an IED strike outside Mosul on August 15, 2012, that had shattered her left femur in 3 places and killed 2 of her medics, Specialist James Chen and Private First Class David Ortega, whose names were redacted then unredacted then redacted again in the file. But the injury wasn't what caught Hargrove's attention. It was the operational history. Katie had served 14 months in Fallujah and Mosul, attached to 3rd Battalion, 7th Special Forces Group, operating in what the paperwork called direct action medical support. She'd been a combat medic, not a nurse. And the field operation summaries, even heavily redacted, showed procedure logs. Needle decompression for tension pneumothorax performed under fire, documented 26 times. Emergency cricothyrotomy, 8 times. Open cardiac massage in field conditions, 3 times. The exact procedure Katie had performed on the Coast Guard commander this morning was listed 37 times across her military record: emergency thoracic intervention, performed while under sustained enemy fire, performed while wounded herself, performed while maintaining medical operations in a siege environment where the survival rate for critically wounded personnel was classified but implied to be catastrophically low. Hargrove sat motionless, the file open in front of him, Dennis Walsh watching from the corner of the room like a man who'd just made the worst decision of his life. Katie Morrison wasn't a nurse who'd gotten lucky with an emergency procedure. She was a trained combat medic with more real-world emergency surgical experience than most emergency room physicians. She had federal credentials and military rank and a history of performing exactly what he'd wanted to crucify her for performing. If her military background became public, if her medical credentials were verified against her actual training, the hospital's entire termination case would evaporate like morning fog. Worse, the hospital would look like it had fired a highly qualified provider for racism, discrimination, or institutional incompetence. The board members would turn on administration. The lawyers would smell a settlement. Hargrove had maybe 72 hours before the commander woke up completely and started asking who saved his life. He had to move faster. The forged documentation took shape in his office that same night. Hargrove pulled up Katie's personnel file on his own terminal and began creating a paper trail that would make her termination look inevitable. He backdated complaint forms from nurses he'd pressured into signing, petty grievances about attitude, attendance, patient interaction, and assigned them timestamps from 6 months prior, when Katie had been invisible and unnamed. He altered her credentials verification document, noting discrepancies in stated qualifications versus documented training and flagging her nursing program as unverified. He created an incident report from the morning of the commander's code, describing Katie's actions as unauthorized practice, dangerous deviation from established protocols, direct threat to patient safety, all while listing himself as the attending physician who'd made the clinical decision, not her. The file grew thicker with each fabrication. By 11:33 p.m., it looked airtight. A pattern of performance issues leading to a justified termination. A provider who'd misrepresented her qualifications and acted outside her scope of practice in a way that could have ended catastrophically instead of luckily. Hargrove saved the file, encrypted it, and sent copies to 3 board members he'd cultivated over years of small favors and hospital politics: Patricia Hodges, the risk management administrator, James Sutton, a retired surgeon who'd hired Hargrove a decade earlier, and Catherine Wu, the board chairman's protégé. His message was simple: emergency credentials review meeting, tomorrow at 1 p.m. Recommend immediate suspension pending investigation. Then he poured scotch and waited for morning. The termination meeting happened in Conference Room B at 1:47 p.m. the following afternoon. Katie sat across from Hargrove and hospital administrator Janet Hodges, who'd been positioned as a neutral witness but whose sympathetic expression had been pre-approved in a hallway conversation 15 minutes earlier. A second administrator, Tom Breslin from legal, sat with his notebook closed, a gesture meant to signal that this was informal, not confrontational, just a serious talk between professionals. The room had been chosen deliberately, small, windowless, nowhere to hide. Hargrove's voice carried the exact tone of reluctant authority. "Ms. Morrison, thank you for coming in. We've completed our review of the incident from Tuesday morning. We need to discuss your actions during the code." Katie's face showed nothing. No apprehension. No preparation. Just absolute stillness, as if she were observing the meeting from outside her own body. "You performed needle decompression on the patient without direct physician authorization," Hargrove continued, each word measured like medication in a syringe. "Regardless of the outcome, and I want to emphasize, the outcome was fortunate, this represents a serious breach of nursing scope of practice. Nurses don't perform invasive thoracic procedures. That's surgical territory." Janet Hodges nodded sympathetically. "We have to think about liability," she said, glancing at Tom Breslin. "If something had gone wrong, if he'd arrested from a complication caused by the procedure, the hospital would be liable. We'd be liable." Tom Breslin finally opened his notebook. Your personnel file shows some pattern concerns that have come to light during this review, he said carefully. Attendance discrepancies, questions about your stated qualifications. He slid a document across the table, the forged credentials review, timestamps perfectly positioned, facts perfectly twisted. Katie read it with the same blank expression. She didn't argue. She didn't try to explain that she'd performed that procedure on combat medics in Mosul under fire, that she'd kept a siege perimeter alive for 40 hours without resupply, that her qualifications weren't just legitimate but were classified at a level that made these civilians look like children playing with medicine. What would she say? The truth was a weapon she couldn't fire without destroying the quiet life she'd built. Silence was her only option. Hargrove slid the termination document toward her. Effective immediately, your employment at Oak Creek Memorial is terminated for breach of scope of practice and misrepresentation of credentials. We're asking for your voluntarily surrender of your badge and access credentials. The paper was crisp, the words final. Katie picked up the pen on the table and signed it, steady hand, steady pressure, no tremor. The signature was a military signature, clean block letters, efficient, removing all personality. Janet Hodges looked almost sad. We're sorry it came to this, she said, and meant it, because she genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. Katie collected her employee badge, set it on the table, and stood. Nobody tried to stop her. She walked out of the conference room, past the cardiac monitoring station where the Coast Guard commander was sleeping peacefully in room for 12, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of a man given a second chance, monitored by equipment and nurses who had no idea who'd saved him. The machines beeped their steady rhythm. The monitors showed normal sinus rhythm. Everything Hargrove's record said Katie hadn't been trained to create. She didn't look at him as she passed. The drive home was silent. Katie kept her hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, the way she'd been trained. The termination letter sat on the passenger seat, edges curling slightly in the afternoon heat. Norfolk's traffic moved around her like water around a stone, people leaving work, heading home, living normal lives where job loss didn't mean watching your son's college fund evaporate. At 4:23 p.m., her apartment was dark and quiet. She kicked off her shoes and sat on the kitchen floor, still wearing scrubs, the fluorescent lights above casting everything in white. The second shift nurse would be starting soon. The night staff would arrive. Oak Creek Memorial would continue functioning, beds filling, monitors beeping, crises resolved by people who understood the real stakes of their work. Katie wasn't one of them anymore. At 7:45 p.m., her 12-year-old son Marcus came through the door expecting the normal Tuesday routine, mom working nights, dinner in the refrigerator, homework waiting. Instead he found her at the kitchen table, still in the same scrubs, still in the same position, the termination letter in one hand and a photograph of his older brother Bradley in Special Forces uniform in the other. Tears ran silently down her face, the first time Marcus had seen her cry since his father left 5 years earlier. Mom. His voice cracked with fear that no 12-year-old should have to feel. Why are you home? It's not midnight yet. Katie couldn't find the words. How do you explain to a child that the world punishes people for being too good at keeping others alive? That the rule breakers get the positions while the heroes get fired? That sometimes protecting people means being willing to lose everything, and sometimes you lose it anyway? Did we lose the house? Marcus asked, because kids understand economics faster than anyone wants them to. Is the school trip cancelled? Mom, are we going to be okay? Katie pulled him close instead of answering, and he felt her shaking in a way that told him everything he needed to know. Everything was not okay. Everything was the opposite of okay. Everything was ending. That same evening, in his home office overlooking Norfolk Harbor, Dr. Hargrove poured a second scotch and opened his laptop. The forged incident report sat in a folder on his desktop, time-stamped and archived, copies already sent to hospital legal and the board members. He'd covered every angle. Katie's termination was airtight, documented, defensible. The witnesses, Janet Hodges and Tom Breslin, believed in the narrative completely. Dennis Walsh would keep his mouth shut because the photographs of Walsh's daughter were sitting in a safety deposit box with specific instructions. Even if Katie tried to appeal, the falsified timestamps and altered credentials would stand up against her word. She had no proof. She had nothing. Hargrove took a long drink and felt the burn of scotch and victory at the same time. The pharmaceutical diversion would continue. The shipments would go where they needed to go. The money would keep flowing. Katie Morrison was neutralized. By morning, he'd make a routine call to the FBI to report her for practicing outside her scope of practice, which would put a federal flag on her record that would keep her from being hired anywhere else in the state. She was finished. At 9:31 p.m., in room for 12, Commander Thomas Chen opened his eyes to the evening shift nurse checking his monitors. His mind was clear. The sedation had worn off. And the first thought that came to him, with crystal clarity, was a question that had to be answered. Nurse, who was the provider who saved me during the code? I need to thank her. The night nurse checked the chart, confused. Let me find out, Commander. She made a call to the charge desk, and the charge nurse put her on hold to check the code documentation. Hargrove's name appeared as the attending. No nurse was mentioned. But the charge nurse had been there. She'd seen Katie push into the room. She'd seen the needle decompression performed with surgical precision. She'd seen the hiss of air escaping. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that Dr. Hargrove had been 3 floors away during the entire code, reviewing pharmacy reports. What had happened that morning, and what the charts now claimed had happened, didn't match. And that mismatch, once started, would unravel everything Hargrove had built. The termination meeting lasted exactly 4 minutes. Dr. Hargrove sat across from Katie in the Chief of Medicine's office, flanked by 2 hospital administrators, a carefully orchestrated stage. His voice carried that practiced tone of regret, the kind a man uses when he's doing something difficult but necessary. Major Morrison, your actions in the cardiac unit, while well-intentioned, constituted practicing outside your scope of licensure. Needle decompression is a physician's procedure. Your training as a registered nurse does not authorize emergency interventions of that magnitude. He glanced at the administrators, gauging their reactions. We have a duty to protect our patients and our institution. The board has determined that your employment must be terminated effective immediately. Katie didn't move. She didn't blink. Her hand sat flat on the table, and when Hargrove slid the termination letter across to her, she picked it up and read every word without expression. The silence in that room was the kind that only comes when someone refuses to give you the reaction you're demanding. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He'd expected tears, or anger, or pleading. He got nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was level as a rifle sight. I understand. She walked out still wearing her scrubs, the termination letter folded once and held loosely in her left hand. That evening, Katie sat at her kitchen table with a letter on one side and a photograph on the other. The photo showed her son Bradley in his Special Forces uniform, taken during his last visit to Norfolk 3 months before the IED in Mosul took him. His eyes were alive in that photograph, 17 years old, already bearing the weight of training that made men into machines, and smiling like he had no idea how fragile a body could be. She stared at both documents with the same level gaze. One marked the end of her career, the other marked the end of her son. Tears slid down her face silently, tracking slow paths as she tried to find the words to explain to her 12-year-old why Mom was home at 6 in the evening instead of 8, why her voice sounded like something breaking at the edges. When her son Marcus came through the front door from school, his backpack slung over one shoulder, he found her exactly like that, scrubs damp from the day, papers in front of her, tears she wasn't bothering to hide anymore. He was old enough to know that mothers didn't cry unless something had broken. He set his backpack down slowly. What happened? Come sit, she said, and heard how hollow her voice sounded. She pulled him close, this boy who still had his whole life ahead of him, and tried to explain what it meant when the world decided you were expendable. We're going to be okay, she heard herself say, but the words felt like a question rather than a statement. The commander regained consciousness at 11:23 a.m. the next morning. His eyes found the ceiling first, then the monitors beside his bed, then the young nurse checking his vitals. Where am I? His voice was rough, unused. Oak Creek Memorial. Norfolk, Virginia. You've been unconscious for 16 hours. The commander nodded slowly, processing. His hand moved to his left chest, feeling the thick bandage beneath the hospital gown. Who did the decompression? The nurse hesitated. Dr. Hargrove was there when, no, the commander interrupted, his voice sharpening despite the pain. Who actually did it? I remember a woman. Military bearing. Hands that moved like she knew exactly what she was doing. The nurse glanced toward the door. That was Katie Morrison. One of our nurses. But, get her, the commander said. Get her now. Within 30 minutes, that simple request triggered what would become the unraveling of everything Dr. Hargrove had constructed. Hospital Administrator Patricia Vance made the call to IT services and discovered something that made her stomach drop. 3 weeks earlier, an IT contractor named Dennis Walsh had logged into the federal classified database using his credentials, accessing Katie Morrison's sealed military file, a massive federal privacy violation. When Vance pulled the access logs, she found Dr. Hargrove's name attached to the access request, dated the morning after Katie had performed the decompression. Her next call was to the DEA. What the DEA found when they launched their audit should have been obvious weeks earlier. 17 post-surgical patients over 8 months, all prescribed opioids by Dr. Hargrove, all with medication dosages that didn't match what was actually administered. 16 of those patients had complained about inadequate pain relief despite having medication signed out to them. The pattern was as clear as a trail of blood in snow. Hargrove had been diverting controlled substances, oxycodone, fentanyl, morphine, moving them out through a contact at Portsmouth Naval Hospital. Katie had stumbled onto federal drug trafficking by doing her job properly. The FBI descended on Oak Creek Memorial on a Thursday morning. Special Agent Maria Torres walked into the conference room where Hargrove was conducting a departmental meeting and said 4 words that changed everything. Dr. Hargrove, you're under arrest. Her voice carried the unmistakable weight of federal authority, the kind that doesn't negotiate or discuss. Torres laid out the case in brutal precision. The forged incident report was displayed on the conference room screen, the document Hargrove had created 3 hours after Katie's emergency intervention, backdating complaints from nurses who'd never filed them, altering timestamps on credential verifications, fabricating scope of practice violations with the kind of calculated precision that only made it worse. You illegally accessed Major Morrison's classified military records through an IT contractor, Torres said, her voice like ice water in a glass. You created false documentation to justify her termination. You did this to cover up pharmaceutical diversion spanning 8 months and affecting minimum 67 patients. The emails were displayed next. Hargrove pressuring nurses to sign false statements. Hargrove instructing Dennis Walsh to delete access logs, a conversation captured in messages that somehow hadn't been erased. Hargrove contacting board members at midnight to expedite Katie's firing before the DEA audit could be completed. Each revelation made him smaller, like watching someone deflate. The calculation drained from his face, replaced by the raw understanding that his career, his medical license, his freedom were all being dismantled in real time. Agent Torres recited his rights in the kind of steady voice that had done this 1,000 times before. The handcuffs clicked shut with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Camera flashes erupted, local news had been tipped off, and they were filming the perp walk. Hargrove was led through the hospital corridor past staff members who stopped mid-conversation to watch, past the cardiac unit where Commander Chen sat in a wheelchair, his left lung still healing from the tension pneumothorax that could have killed him. And past Katie Morrison, who stood motionless in the hallway, her expression giving nothing away as the man who destroyed her career was led past her in handcuffs. His face collapsed, the panic of a man watching his entire life disintegrate in 4 minutes, the humiliation of it, the absolute realization that she was better than him and always had been. He looked at her as they passed, and Katie didn't look away. She met his eyes with the same cold, flat stare she'd given him in that elevator, the same stare that had haunted him because it never showed fear or anger or any emotion at all. It showed something worse, absolute certainty. She'd known what she was, and she'd known he'd eventually find out. Hospital Administrator Patricia Vance addressed the room immediately after the perp walk. Dr. Hargrove's medical license will be revoked pending criminal trial. Federal charges include illegal access to classified records, fraud, pharmaceutical diversion, and conspiracy. We failed you catastrophically. Her voice cracked slightly when she looked directly at Katie. Major Morrison, on behalf of Oak Creek Memorial, I apologize. Commander Chen added from his wheelchair, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from leading men in combat zones. She saved my life using skills earned in service to this country. You repaid her with humiliation and termination. The Coast Guard will be reconsidering all medical contracts with this facility until leadership and culture change fundamentally. The room shifted. Every board member, every administrator understood instantly that Oak Creek Memorial had just lost millions in annual revenue. The weight of that consequence hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Katie finally spoke, her voice steady and level. I just want my job back. And an assurance that no other nurse gets targeted for doing what's right. 6 months later, Dr. William Hargrove sat in a strip mall urgent care clinic in Portsmouth, treating a high school athlete's sprained ankle. The clinic smelled of cheap disinfectant and fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead like angry wasps, a stark contrast to the modern cardiac unit at Oak Creek Memorial where his career had ended. His hands moved through the examination with mechanical precision, the muscle memory of a doctor who no longer believed in what he was doing. A colleague mentioned seeing the federal indictment on the news. Trial date was set for September. Federal charges carried 5 to 10 years. Katie Morrison stood in her office at Oak Creek Memorial, nameplate on the door reading her name and rank, Major Katie Morrison, USAR, retired, Director of Emergency Medicine. The office was clean and modern with a view of the Norfolk waterway where Coast Guard cutters moved through the channels like grey sharks. Behind her desk, on a shelf visible to everyone who entered, sat her combat boots, the leather still cracked from years in Mosul, sand still embedded in the treads, no longer hidden in the back of a locker. Next to them sat her Distinguished Service Cross and Silver Star in display cases, and a photograph of her son Bradley in his Special Forces uniform, arm around Commander Chen, both grinning like they owned the world. She was teaching a training session when the camera pulled back, running through needle decompression technique with new nurses on a mannequin, her voice clear and confident. You'll probably never need this skill in a civilian hospital. But if you do, hesitate costs lives. Trust your training. Trust your hands. Trust what you know. The nurses watched with absolute respect, several taking notes furiously. Her limp was still there, some wounds don't heal, but she didn't hide it anymore. It was just part of who she was now. Marcus stopped by her office after school, homework spread across her desk while she finished charts, completely comfortable in the space where his mom worked, finally understanding what she did and why she'd never talked about it before. Commander Chen visited monthly to check on his recovery, stopping to thank her again, telling her stories about her son that made her laugh and cry at the same time. When Katie Morrison left work at shift change, the camera held on those combat boots sitting on the shelf, visible to everyone. Staff members nodded respectfully as she passed, no longer the invisible nurse they dismissed, but something impossible to ignore. If you're watching this story and thinking about your own battles, the quiet ones nobody sees, if you're in a place where you've been underestimated or pushed down, share this video. Subscribe for more stories about people who fought back. Comment below. Have you ever been proven right after being written off? We read every single comment.